This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the European Middle Ages, the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire had developed into a fragmented group of city-states by 476 AD. Rome no longer had a centralized authority or a clear taxation system. Western Rome was eventually conquered by the Roman general Odoacer. Diocletian had attempted to solve the problems of Rome before this by separating the Roman Empire into two halves, the eastern and the western halves. He did this before 476 AD in order to try to save Western Rome from eventual total collapse by the German tribes that were invading into the area. However, this failed and Western Rome fell. Byzantium. Eastern Rome at one point included Greece, Syria, and the Anatolian Peninsula. Its strength was its location on the Anatolian Peninsula at the Dardanelles Strait, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire had basically established a fortress city which was almost impossible to penetrate and was used primarily as a trade station between the crossroads of the Middle East and Africa. The Byzantine empires also developed something called Greek fire. It included oil, sulfur, and lime. They would launch this from tubes at Arab invaders on the sea, and that kept them out of Byzantine for several centuries. The Byzantium political organization. The emperor had absolute control over the hierarchy of army and the priests. However, Byzantium also developed something called Caesaropapism. Caesaropapism was different from the Western Roman Empire. It was a sharing of power between the emperor and the patriarch in appointing bishops. The patriarch is sort of like the pope, but doesn't have the same kind of power over the church. The emperor within Byzantium shares power with the patriarch. This is different from Western Rome, where the pope is separate from the king. This created a tendency in the Eastern Orthodox for politics and theological leaders to be much more entwined than in the West. Differences with the Western Church. Eastern and Western churches disagreed over the following issues. In the Eastern Church, the use of icons or pictures of saints were used for worship. The East also used the Greek language, while the West used Latin. The East had interdependence of authorities, while the West believed in the absolute control of the Pope. The East allowed for priests to marry and have children, and the East also mandated priests to wear beards as a sign of masculinity. In 1054, both sides excommunicated each other over the central role of papal control over the previous Roman and now European countries. Within Western Rome, papal control was much more absolute, whereas within Byzantium, the patriarch's control was shared with the other bishops. Russian development. The Mongols had controlled Eastern Europe and Russia. Slavic people eventually broke free and were ruled by Vladimir of Kiev. Vladimir looked for religion to unite his people, including Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And in fact, at one point, he considered possibly becoming Islamic. However, he disagreed with Islam's forbidding of alcohol, so he ended up accepting Orthodox Christianity due to its majestic use of ritual, painting, and icons. Note that Vladimir was using Orthodox Christianity to emphasize the power of the leaders as God's representatives. Russia saw itself as the Third Rome, and this started up the Russian belief of itself as a national messiah for the world. The creation of Europe. After Rome, Europe was broken into numerous city-states and provinces. It lacked a clear connection with the Silk Road trade route. This doesn't mean that there was no connection whatsoever. In fact, Europe did have an indirect connection through the Mediterranean Sea, but it just lacked a clear connection over land with the Silk Road. This will be important in the long run for European exploration. Europe had fallen behind during this time period in science and math and technological innovations. China and India were far more ahead. Charlemagne started the process of centralizing countries in France and the Germanic regions. Otto I continued by creating a Holy Roman Empire. Eventually, under Charlemagne, a treaty was formed called the Treaty of Verdun. The Treaty of Verdun was an attempt to take all the areas that had been fragmented after the fall of Rome and create those into much more of kingdoms, and eventually they would become nation-states. Social organization. All Middle Age kingdoms in Europe, India, Middle East, and Asia established a system called feudalism. Feudalism was based upon the hierarchical relationships of duty and obligations between lords, or also known as vassals, and peasants. The religious justification for this was the Great Chain of Being. Under this idea, God had created people and a human nature. Each person carried different skills, talents, and abilities. And these abilities were interconnected with each other in order to create communities that will work and have order. That means that our place in society is preordained by God and carries divine duties and responsibilities. Under the great chain of being, individualism was not stressed. Community was stressed, sort of like a big chain or fabric. This chart demonstrates the type of hierarchy or chain that was created at the time. Notice that according to this, the Pope and the Church Magisterium were supposed to be in charge of feudalism. Underneath that would then be the monarch or the king, then vassals, then priests, and peasants. However, within this system, all people were either vassals or peasants. The way that you can see this is this. The peasants, obviously, who are at the bottom, are underneath the vassalage or leadership of the priests. But priests are vassals to the landowners. Vassals are peasants to the king, and the king is then a peasant to the pope. So then is the pope basically the vassal of all? No, because the pope is supposed to be subordinate to God. So within this system, all people are vassals or peasants with obligations to one another. Feudalism Explained. The main relationship, like we have been talking about, is the vassal-peasant relationship. The vassal was the landowner, and this included all landowners, encompassing the king and the church leaders. The vassals had the responsibility to provide work and to provide order to the kingdom. They would provide this on land-owning areas called manors, or under what was known as manorialism. Manorialism was when vassals would establish a manor for peasants to work on. The peasants then had the responsibility to work and create orderly families under the religious system that was created, which was in the West, Roman Catholicism, and in the East, Orthodox Byzantium. Contradictions of the Middle Ages. The growth of manors led to a surplus of agricultural goods. This provided a surplus for growing cities. Now this is what eventually is going to undermine the system of feudalism. Cities became necessary for the king to develop a tax base to build power as for a kingdom. The kings then started to build nations like France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and Netherlands. However, this meant that the growth of cities were based around values of individualism and competition. As cities grew, farming decreased. More and more people became merchants and established small businesses. But that meant that you had more individual competition. This will undermine the great chain of being. Catholic Traditions and Change, Part 1. St. Augustine. Augustine was born in Africa to Monica. He was known during this time for his sexual exploits throughout all of Africa. But he was also interested in his study of philosophy. He eventually became a part of a philosophy called Manichaeanism. Manichaeanism teaches that there is a good and there is an evil in the world. In fact, the good is a good God, and then there is an evil God. They compete amongst each other, and neither one can ever destroy the other. Now, this is different from Christianity, but there are some similarities. And so at one point, he was converted to Christianity when he was listening to some Christian bishops discussing morality and salvation. After he converted, he wrote a personal book on his sin called The Confessions. He argued that all human beings suffer from original sin, and he believed that the universe can be divided into the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. He argued that only God's grace can provide true salvation. Therefore, only the kingdom of God is perfect. The kingdom of man was essentially corruptible due to sin. The reason why this will be important for politics is because Augustine's philosophy is basically teaching the idea of the great chain of being. If the kingdom of man is corruptible, then the only way that we can live within it is to establish a system of order, obligations, and duty. Catholic Traditions and Change, Part 2. Thomas Aquinas, who comes hundreds of years later, lived after the Crusades. Europe, after the Crusades, received many of the great books of Greek philosophers from the conquests in the Middle East. The Arabs had kept all these great books safe in their libraries for centuries. Aquinas studied these books and then wrote a book called the Summa Theologica. He argued for something called the natural law tradition, which stressed that man could know God's will through proper reason and education. This doesn't seem like this is all that big of a deal, but it actually has a dramatic change for the Augustinian tradition, because it emphasizes that there is one very strong goodness in man, and that is God's gift to us of reason. But if this is the case, if reason is so powerful and individual reason can be so good, then why can't we use good in order to change the world itself or the kingdom of man for the better? Why Europe? The big question is why Europe started to make a move to take over the position of China and India. And this comes at the end of the Middle Ages. Here are some possible explanations. Number one, Europe was fragmented into different regions. This intensified a competition for power and innovation. During the Middle Ages, this was not a benefit. In fact, China was far more centralized and would dominate during that time period. But when Europeans started to go out and explore, and when they started to become more important for merchants, power and innovation becomes much more important than having a centralized power. Europe would eventually also develop a separation of church and state that allowed for the development of independent scholars and universities. And that would allow for the creation of new technologies and their execution of them in order to do things like the building of businesses, the building of science, and exploration. Europe borrowed and stole from China many of its innovations. But the difference is Europe began to implement these technologies precisely when China began to fear their applications. And number four, Europe began to develop a relatively independent merchant and business group that would challenge the power of the king. China suspected the power of merchants. This is also true of India. Both China and India believed that the merchants were basically too self-interested and selfish, and they restricted their development. In Europe, there was a similar suspicion of merchants, but merchants had more power, and as they put more checks on the king, this allowed for more innovation and competition during the age of exploration.